This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio is brought to you by the IEEE Computer Society and by IEEE Software Magazine. Online at computer.org/software.
Welcome to Software Engineering Radio. I'm your host, Brijesh Ammanath, and today my guest is Jon Smart. Jon is a business agility practitioner, thought leader, and coach. Jon is a lead author of the award-winning and best-selling book, Sooner, Safer, Happier, Patterns and Antipatterns for Business Agility. Jon previously was Global Business Agility Lead and partner at Deloitte. Prior to this, Jon led ways of working globally for Barclays Bank. Jon has been an agile and lean practitioner since the early 90s. Jon is also the founder of Enterprise Agility Leaders Network, a member of Programming Committee for DevOps Enterprise Summit, a member of the Business Agility Institute Advisory Council, a guest speaker at London Business School, and speaks at numerous conferences every year. Both me and Jon have worked together in our previous roles, and I have also reviewed Jon's book. Jon, welcome to Software Engineering Radio.
Thank you, Brijesh.
We will be talking today about patterns and anti-patterns for the successful delivery of software in enterprises, based on Jon's book, Better Value, Sooner, Safer, Happier. We have covered Agile in enterprises previously in episode 420, Ryan Ripley on making Scrum work, episode 401, Jeremy Miller on Waterfall versus Agile, episode 238, Linda Rising on the Agile Brain. Let's get started with the session by understanding the drivers behind writing the book. Who was the target audience for the book, and what motivated you to write the book, Jon?
So, thank you, Brijesh. The target audience for the book is leaders at all levels in all roles. So it's very much aimed at people working in large organizations looking to improve their ways of working, and not only people in technology, not only software engineering, but also outside of technology or people with no technology background. So as much as possible, the goal is to try to use plain English and minimize the use of language that might be perceived to be jargon. And in terms of what prompted me to write the book, I've had, I think, speaking at the DevOps Enterprise Summit, knowing Gene Kim, and then talking to Gene about the book writing process, it was just like an aspiration I had and a bit of an experiment to write a book. And I think being in that DevOps Enterprise Summit, IT Revolution community, there are a number of people that have written books, and Gene running his own book publishing company. So then I had a conversation with Gene, hey, what does it take to write a book? And then next thing you know, 2.5 years later, there's a book.
Thanks. I think it's pretty clear to me and the audience on the drivers for writing this book. And I know in your book you talk about better ways of working in the age of digital and the focus shifting to outcomes. What do you think has driven this change?
So in Sooner, Safer, Happier, we are absolutely advocating a focus on the outcomes first and foremost. And the anti-pattern here is where organizations do an agile transformation, where it's all about the A word, it's all about agile. Agile is not the goal. The goal is something else. The goal is quicker time to value, quicker time to learning, more engagement with colleagues, higher levels of engagement, happier customers. So that this is my key learning, with the lesson I learned the hard way and the mistake I made when I started out leading ways of working across a large financial services organization with 80,000 people. We were running an agile transformation. We were measuring the wrong things. We were measuring how many agile teams and so on, how many people have been trained in agile. But that's not the goal. The goal isn't to do agile. Hence the language of better, value, sooner, safer, happier, which is quality. Better is quality, value is value, which is unique. Sooner is time to value. Safer is agile, not fragile. And happier is happier customers, colleagues, citizens, and climate. So what we are coaching organizations on, advocating for, is to focus on the outcomes. And then there's not one size fits all as to how you get there, because every organization is unique. And that is a message that seems to be resonating, not surprisingly.
Thank you, Jon. And I also know that in your book, you talk about business agility. I wonder if you could explain a bit about what is business agility and why it is important.
So we are lucky enough to be alive in a once in 100-year pivot in ways of working, in how we do what we do. And it might even be more than once in 100 year. It might actually be once in 250 years. So what is business agility? It is improving ways of working in order to improve outcomes. And the background to this is repeating technology-led revolutions. And so back in 1771, we have the first industrial revolution. And that was the very first time that we went from kind of craft working to division of labor and working in a factory. And it is still the case today, 250 years later, that you can trace the DNA of ways of working in a large organization which is doing knowledge work, which is unique and unknowable. You can trace the ways of working all the way back to 1771 and the very first factories that were in Derbyshire in northern England. And so business agility is improving ways of working to deliver better outcomes. And it's triggered by the latest technologically led revolution, which is the age of digital. And it's driven by competitive pressure because no longer can companies take a long time to have a feedback loop on the value that they're producing.
Right. And do you think business agility, or the lack of rather, are more of a problem in large enterprises rather than smaller firms?
No, I don't actually. So I think it's less to do with size, and it's because what I'm seeing is for both small and medium companies, it doesn't take long for small and medium companies to end up with the same level of, cautiously use the word dysfunction, but the same level of bureaucracy and dysfunction as a large company. And it doesn't take long for people to start to introduce more process, more gated controls, and to slow down the flow of value, irrespective of the size. And there are some relatively small companies I see who are not very nimble and don't have a lot of agility. So yeah, I think it's kind of it's a human characteristic to keep adding more process and bureaucracy.
All right. So irrespective of size, business agility or lack of this problem, which is across the firms in the industry right now.
Yes, if the organization doesn't have an intentional priority and focus on time to value and time to learning and minimizing time to learning, then yes, that's the case, yes.
You mentioned the 4 metrics: better for quality, value, which is unique OKRs, sooner for time to market, safer for governance and compliance, and happier for morale. We will dig into each of these measures, but I just wanted to understand, when you look at it holistically, is any one particular measure more important depending on which stage the company is at, or the project or the program is at?
I would say no, definitely not. What I would say is that the 5 measures of better, value, sooner, safer, happier are equally important because they are balancing outcomes. So what we've seen is that organizations that reduce time to value but do it badly, for example, working people harder rather than improving the system of work and removing impediments, what happens, not surprisingly, is quality goes down and happiness goes down. So they are balancing measures. So if you are reducing your time to value, you're delivering value sooner, you should see quality get better and you should see happiness get better. And if you don't, you know that you're not going about it the right way. So I would say that they are equally important.
Right. With that, let's deep dive into some of the patterns and anti-patterns that you have covered in the book. And you also touched on the first anti-pattern that you mentioned in your book, which was doing an agile transformation. Why is doing an agile or a lean or a DevOps transformation an anti-pattern? Can you expand on this and its related pattern, which is the focusing on outcomes?
Yeah. So as I said, agile is not the goal. Lean is not the goal. DevOps is not the goal. It's a means to an end. It isn't the end. And so often what happens when an organization runs an agile transformation, all of the focus is on the wrong thing. The focus is on, are we doing agile? How many agile teams do we have? How many people have been through agile training? How many product owners do we have? How many teams are doing stand-ups? Who's doing sprints? It does not necessarily lead to better outcomes. For example, Nokia Mobile, Symbian operating system, which no longer exists because they went bust. According to the chairman of Nokia, the thing that killed Symbian was a lack of psychological safety. So bad news was being buried. Bad news was not bubbling up. And the Symbian team were scoring, 99% on their how agile are we test, on their Scrum test. So Scrum didn't save Symbian. And that's because Scrum is not the goal. Agile's not the goal. It's the outcomes of quality, value, time to value, safety, and happiness. So that's the anti-pattern of Agile transformation. There is a related anti-pattern, which is the word transformation. So a couple of anti-patterns here. One is doing a capital T transformation, a big bang. A big bang transformation is an anti-pattern because it takes time for people to unlearn and relearn. And so if an organization does a big bang where you leave on Friday, you're a project manager, you start on Monday, you're a product owner, and this is across the entire organization with tens of thousands of people, there is no way that people can magically transform over the weekend. So you end up with new labels on the same old behavior. Humans have a limited velocity to unlearn and relearn. So if you want to go faster, we need to encourage the speed of unlearning. To do that, we need to have more psychological safety. So in order to go faster, the best thing to do is to increase the psychological safety. So that's the anti-pattern around the word transformation. So the pattern is, instead, focus on the outcomes. I recommend better value, sooner, safer, happier, quality, value, time to value, safety, and happiness. And think big, start small, learn fast. So don't do a capital T transformation, do a lowercase t, continuously transforming. It's not a project. It doesn't have a start date and an end date. It's about continuous improvement, aligned to the outcomes. You are never done because human systems entropy, human systems go backwards. So it's about continuously improving with a lowercase t, with empowerment and autonomy.
Excellent. You do touch on quite a few points and topics that I plan to cover as we go through the session. And I'll pick on a few right now. So you stressed a lot on outcomes. How are outcomes different from outputs?
So output works in a factory type scenario. In the age of oil and mass production, the focus is on output. And the definition of productivity is the number of units of output per unit of input. So an output is a thing. It's a deliverable, it's a widget, it is maybe a piece of software, it's a system. And if we focus on the output, so for example, have you delivered system X? Have we delivered feature Y? Those are all outputs, those are not outcomes. And so the common anti-pattern here at organizations is a relentless focus on the output, but with hardly any focus at all on the outcome. So the reason for the output is to achieve a certain outcome. So the outcome might be increase market share, increase revenue, support more first-time buyers onto the property ladder. It might be increase market share in Latin America. It might be help people to buy affordable furniture for their apartment. That's the outcome. So then it might be happier customers, might be another outcome. The output is how you might achieve the outcome. So this is a big mindset shift. This is a big mindset shift from output to outcomes. And this includes experimentation, an experimentation mindset, because change is unique. Change is unknowable. There are unknown unknowns. We don't know what we don't know. We've never done it before. And the only way to learn is by doing. So we have to run experiments and we have to minimize time to learning and feedback so that we can pivot, so that we can have the cheapest cost of failure is what we're looking for. So this is a big change in mindset from it's not about milestones in a project plan. That is not the definition of success. The definition of success is the key results in an OKR, objectives and key results. Have we actually added value, and are we adding thin slices of value?
Right. Moving on, I want to touch on psychological safety, because in your book, you do mention that this is number one factor in building high-performing teams. Let's start with the basics. What is psychological safety, and why is it so important?
Psychological safety is the ability to feel safe to ask questions, to challenge authority, to have your voice heard, to express your thoughts without fear of repercussion, without fear of being shot down or belittled in any way. It's the ability to have open, vulnerable conversations with respect. And it's also about not having a blame culture. So if something goes wrong, it's not because somebody did something wrong. It's because there was something in the system of work that enabled this thing to happen. So for an example of this, the British Airways, a cleaner ended up, shutting down a data center, hitting a power switch, which switched off a whole bunch of servers. And that meant that there was a global outage for British Airways of their IT systems. And, the CEO of IAG, the parent company, blamed the cleaner, blamed the person who flipped the power switch. But no, The real thing at fault there is that it was possible to flick a switch to power down the data center. So that's the key thing about psychological safety. It's a generative culture where people can challenge authority. Just one other example is where the first captain, the first officer, imagine you're flying a plane, you've got the captain and you've got the first officer. So psychological safety is the ability for the first officer to challenge the captain and for the captain to respond productively and positively to the challenge. And there is at least one air disaster, if not more, where there was a lack of psychological safety between the captain and the first officer. So the first officer saw a problem, but didn't say anything because they were fearful for being shouted at. And then that led to an accident.
Right. So closely related to being able to speak up and express your opinions.
Correct. Yes.
How can leaders create a psychologically safe workplace?
And my go-to reference on this is Amy Edmondson and her book called The Fearless Organization. And I'm going to quote Amy Edmondson on this in terms of how to do this. So step number 1 is set the stage. Step number 2 is invite participation. Step number 3 is respond positively. So step number 1, set the stage, is psychological safety is important to us. It's a behavioral trait which I, as a leader, I value this behavioral trait very much. I'm very keen to nurture a culture of psychological safety. What that means is it's not about blaming people. There's a blame-free culture. It's about the system of work. And if you have an opinion, if you have a thought, you can respectfully challenge people with emotional intelligence and so on. So that's setting the stage. Indicator that this behavior is desired. Number 2, invite participation. So then if something does go wrong, there's often learned helplessness with people. And so just by saying, hey, everyone, behave in a psychologically safe manner, it's not going to happen, especially if there's been a culture of fear in the past. I've seen this happen where leaders have said, we want to create we want there to be a psychologically safe environment. But the people have had so much fear in the past that it takes, 2 or 3 years before people start actually feeling safe. So you've got to, really encourage people. So that's invite participation. Let's celebrate intelligent failure. Have a town hall. Actually celebrate learning through failure. That's number 2. Number 3 is respond positively, respond productively. So when something does go wrong, role model the behaviors. Make it all about the system of work, make it all about what could we do to prevent this from happening before. And it's not about the individual. And also, I think when having kind of team sessions, psychological safety is allowing people to express their thoughts and just acknowledging that everyone's perspective is right, and not putting people down or not saying you're wrong, but just honoring other people's perspectives.
Thanks, John. I think psychological safety, you have explained it very well. And our listeners will now know why it's important and what it is. In your book about leadership, you also talk about transformational leadership. What are the attributes of transformational leadership?
So the attributes of transformational leadership, there are 4 components. The first one is to role model, to walk the talk. The origins of the word lead comes from to guide on a journey. That's where the word comes from, to guide on a journey. So it doesn't mean, hey, you go and do that thing and I'm going to stay here. I'm not going to change. So role model, walk the talk. Number 2 is articulate a clear vision. So this is painting the picture very clearly of what the goal is, what the vision is, what the purpose is. And it should be something that really does have purpose so that people feel intrinsically motivated. So for example, making the world of work more humane. That's a great vision with lots of purpose. The third attribute of transformational leadership is intellectual stimulation. And this is about challenging the status quo, questioning assumptions, experimentation. It requires empowerment, requires autonomy with a very clear goal. And then the fourth one is being a coach. So this is the leader as a coach, coaching people, developing people, recognizing strengths in people and helping people to grow.
Thanks, John. You touched on system entropy, and I think that's something you also go into depth while you describe the anti-pattern, going faster leads to going slower. Can you expand first on what is system entropy? How is it related to technical excellence? And then maybe expand on the anti-pattern itself?
Sure. So entropy, so human systems entropy, technical systems entropy. And what that means is they kind of go backwards over time, kind of get worse. In the case of technology, there's more technical debt, there's more treacle, it takes longer to get stuff done. In the case of human systems, there's more bureaucracy, there's more process, there's more approvals, there's more committees. And we people, we humans, we like to keep on adding processes and rather than taking things away. So given that human systems entropy, given that technical systems entropy over time, i.e. go slower, get more sticky, more treacle-like, it is necessary to continuously improve in terms of culture, in terms of process, and in terms of technology. So technical excellence is very important here because, and this is the problem if the focus is just on Agile and just on Scrum, there's nothing there about technical excellence, unlike extreme programming, where there is a focus on technical excellence. So it's very, very important to have a focus on technical excellence continuously, to continuously refactor, to continuously improve, and to dedicate some bandwidth to that continuous improvement. Improving daily work is as important as daily work. And not doing that, you end up with the go slow to go faster, or you will end up going slower.
Right. So the recommendation or the pattern that you should adopt is go slower to go faster.
Correct. And it's a bit tongue-in-cheek. What that means is make sure that it's important to put time aside all of the time for continuous improvement. In the case of technology, for refactoring and continuously improving not only the technology, but also your ways of working as well.
Right. In this context, you also talk about evergreening. What is evergreening and how can teams be intentional in adopting it?
Yes, evergreening means always staying up to date with the latest versions of libraries, the latest supported versions of software, and never allowing yourself to get so far behind that it's almost impossible to catch up again. And again, a bit like refactoring, it requires intention, it requires being deliberate, it requires bandwidth, it requires time, and it requires money to always stay up to date with the latest version of software.
Thanks. Any examples come to mind where firms have not done it and what was the consequence?
Yeah. So an anonymous example at one large organization where historically there had not been a focus on evergreening the technology landscape. There was a lot of software which was completely unsupported. And I mean like a lot of software, in some cases kind of mission critical parts of the organization, and in some cases that the software that was being used or the platform or the language had been out of support for 10, 15 years. And not only that, but actually was outside of the license. And that was because of a lack of a focus on the topic. And another example is where a third party, I'm sure everyone has seen this in large organizations where you'll have a big third-party system and that big third-party system doesn't get upgraded over time. And it's so out of date that you have no choice. You now can't upgrade to the latest version. And so one example at one organization I worked at, in order to plug in some, in the context of financial services, to plug in some pricing modules, it was necessary to use an unsupported, out-of-date, old version of the C++ compiler because the third-party product was so out of date. So it had a knock-on effect where everything was kept at an old version and it was impossible to upgrade it. So it forces you into a corner where the only thing you can do is slash and burn and rewrite or roll out a new system, which is also not a good idea. So that's an example of the implications of not having an evergreen type focus. Just one thing to add, actually, it also holds the business back. So the ability to add business value, it takes longer, it's harder, and there was a whole load of stuff that can't be done because of a lack of being evergreen.
Right. I completely agree with you, and I've seen quite a few examples in my career as well, whether that's been not C++, but VB6 or COBOL and so on, where it's just been a struggle to upgrade and keep it up to date. You touched on value, and value is usually answering the question, do our solution meet the needs of our customers and the business? But this is a lagging indicator. Are there any leading indicators that help measure value?
That's a good question. So what I find works well is using OKRs to measure value. An OKR, objective and key result, or outcome and key result, what I prefer to call them. And within the key results are your measures of value. And what I recommend is some of your key results are leading key results. They are indicators that might lead to later value. And some of your key results are lagging key results, which are value. So, for example, your lacking key results might be customer net promoter score has gone up by 10 points. And another one might be we've increased our market share from 55% to 65%. So those are two lagging value measures, customer happiness and market share. Some of your leading value measures might be we've had more downloads of the app on the App Store. That itself is not valuable. However, it is a leading indicator that might lead to the lagging value. Another example would be we've gone from 10,000 to 20,000 online applications for a new product using our app from the App Store. Again, the number of online applications is itself not valuable, but it's probably going to lead to an increase in market share. So that's an example of leading and lagging value measures. And what you're trying to do there is you're trying your leading indicators, your leading key results. You're trying to minimize time to learning and minimizing time to value. You're trying to get a really fast feedback loop. And this is where kind of carpaccio comes in. You want really thin slices of value. Get it out to market, get it in the hands of a customer, and then let's see, do the key results start moving?
Right, makes sense. Before we move on to some of the other patterns, I did want to, just wanted to have one final question on tech excellence, which is, what are some good metrics to measure technical excellence?
That's a good question. I would say, off the top of my head, for me, it all comes back to the lagging measures of time to value, so lead time, flow efficiency, the amount of time the work is being worked on versus the end-to-end lead time, quality, and by quality I mean failure demand. I don't mean defects. I mean unplanned work, which is failure demand. That's another measure, quality. And safety. So in terms of better value, sooner, safer, happier, the word safety and safer is in particular to do with mandated controls like information security, data privacy, encrypting data at move, encrypting data at rest, two-factor authentication, not making the newspaper headlines because customer data has been hacked and leaked onto the internet. So safer is another important measure. And then obviously, but this one's usually missed, is happier. And that's happier colleagues as much as it is happier customers. And that's something that's missing from the DORA metrics, or from Accelerate. The word happier is not there. That's the one that's usually missed. So I would say, in summary, time to value, lead time and flow efficiency, quality, safety, and happiness, all of which leads to business value.
Agreed. I guess the greater the technical depth that you've got, the slower you're going to be, and the unhappier developers are going to be because they're going to spend a lot of time working on stuff which is quite old and legacy.
And difficult to work on and has a long lead time. The flow efficiency is low. And also quality will be poor as well in terms of complexity that fits in your head. If it isn't possible to have a short lead time, it's going to end up being big change. And that's complexity that doesn't fit in your head. You're more likely to have quality problems.
Agreed. So moving on, in your book, you write about building the right thing. And in this context, you write about intelligent flow and intelligent control, which is around building the thing right. Let's start off by understanding what is intelligent flow.
So intelligent flow, also known as lean portfolio management. And so there are two components to this. The first component is horizontally having multidisciplinary teams, long-lived multidisciplinary teams aligned to the customer and aligned to the flow of value. So, for example, in financial services, it might be mortgages, it might be current account. In an investment bank, it might be equity trading. In an energy company, it might be low carbon value stream. It might be gas, and it might be electric vehicle charging. So that's the first dimension to intelligent flow, is long-lived multidisciplinary teams with long-lived products, both business products and IT products, aligned to the customer. So there are three things you need. You need to have a thing of value, for example, electric vehicle charging. You need to have value consumers, the customers that turn up and charge their electric vehicles. And you need to have value producers, the team, both the software engineering teams and the hardware teams, and the electrical engineers that create the electric vehicle charging points. So if you've got those three things, something of value, a consumer and a producer, you have a value stream. So that's one dimension. And then on top of that, you have then a vertical dimension. And this is where the OKRs come in, the outcomes and key results. So on top of your nested value streams, you have your OKRs. So now what we have is we have a multidisciplinary team aligned to the customer. They're long-lived with a long-lived product, and they have a very clear goal to achieve, which unites the team across the role-based silos. So we could have electrical engineers, we could have marketing, we could have sales, we could have software engineering. Everyone has the same goal, and the goal is on the value stream.
Got it. So 3 attributes: value, consumer and producer, and long-lived team.
Yep.
For a long-lived team, which is multidisciplinary, what's the career path? How do you retain that team? So you might have the best of intents, and if you're leading such a team and you manage to create it, how do you ensure that there's a retention, and what's a career path for somebody who's within that long-lived team?
Yeah, that's a great question. So especially in a large organizations, value streams are nested. You have a double click. So if we take, for example, a bank is a value stream. Double click. Within that, you've got retail bank, corporate bank, wealth, investment bank, global markets, and so on. Double click on the retail bank. You've got mortgages, everyday banking, maybe pensions, tax-free savings. So likewise in the investment bank, you've got equity trading, debt trading, research. So organizations have nested value streams. So therefore, there is room for career progression within the nested value streams. So an individual might be a product owner at the team level. There is career progression there to become the product owner at the team of teams level, the next level up, and then the next level up, and then the next level up. There is also career progression. So in terms of long-lived teams, just to be really clear, what is meant by this is it's not a case of come together, do a project and disband, which is how it used to be. It also means that it doesn't mean that people are stuck in a team forever. So there still is mobility. There still is the ability to move around, but it's just not all of the time. And it's not based on a project. So it could also be that there's an area that's very small. Maybe there's 2 teams, and career progression could be to go and work in another value stream, which is much bigger. And maybe there's 20 teams. So your sphere of influence and your sphere of control has just grown significantly because it's a bigger area. So there is a very clear career progression. And just to mention one other thing, the pattern that I find to work well is there are 3 leadership roles at every level. There's the value outcome lead, also known as a product owner. There's the team outcome lead or the delivery lead, also sometimes known as a scrum master or a scrum of scrums master. And then the third one is the technical lead, the architecture outcome lead or the technical lead. So that is, the IT, software engineering plus architecture lead. Now, those 3 roles exist at the team level, and it might just be a hat that people wear. It might not be a full-time role. It could just be a hat. And those 3 roles exist at the team of teams level and the team of teams, and so on and so on and so on. So again, there is career progression there as a value outcome lead, as a team lead or a team of teams lead, and as a technical lead.
Thank you. That was a very good answer. We'll move on to another pattern. If you could expand or tell me a bit more about the milestone-driven predicted solutions anti-pattern.
Yeah, so that anti-pattern is where the definition of success is hitting a milestone, a predetermined milestone in a project plan, which was put together at the point of having learnt the least. It is traditionally how organizations have measured success, which is a RAG status, red, amber, green. Is your milestone in your plan? Is it red, amber, or green? And in particular, when there is I'm sure we've all seen this, where there is a lack of psychological safety, nobody wants to put red on their RAG status, on their milestone, because you get summoned to the big boss, to the senior leader, who, if there is a lack of psychological safety, will then give people a hard time around, why are you late on your milestone? Rather than, how can I help you to achieve this goal? So then obviously what happens is bad news is buried. Senior leaders never hear about anything. Everything looks like it's green until there's a massive failure with sunk cost fallacy and things fail to be delivered, which is quite often observed from old ways of working. So that's absolutely an anti-pattern, and organizations are complex adaptive systems. The butterfly flaps its wings and there's a tornado 1,000 miles away. We don't know what we don't know. There are unknown unknowns. We can't possibly predict the future. So therefore, a milestone, the origins of which come from the Roman Empire. They weigh 2 tons, they are sunk 6 feet into the ground, and they are immovable, is a very bad analogy for change, for unknowable change, where actually we want to be adaptive and we want to have agility.
Right. So if I get it, what you're saying is that milestone-driven predicted solution is an anti-pattern because it drives the wrong behavior and it incentivizes team members to hide information so that because red state is seen as something which is bad.
There's that. If there is a lack of psychological safety, there is the added complication of burying bad news. But even if there isn't that lack of psychological safety, it's still suboptimal to view success as a milestone in a Gantt chart, because typically that milestone, again, because it's a focus on the output, not a focus on the outcome. It's a focus on, did we build system X by date Y, or have we not? And the business case was written 18 months ago. No one has ever looked at the business case since. There's no causality. The time from cause and effect is so long that you can't possibly measure value because it could be just a change in the macroeconomic environment. So instead, this is the pivot to focusing on the outcome rather than on the output.
Right, got it.
Building the wrong thing faster makes you wronger.
You touched on Gantt charts. You have a strong opinion on it. Can you start by explaining to our listeners what a Gantt chart is, its historical use, and why you don't favor its use?
So a Gantt chart, Henry Gantt worked with Frederick Winslow Taylor in the early 1900s in the context of manual labor in factories. And the line in the Gantt chart originally used to be called the man days quota. And what it meant was, if you've shoveled enough coal into the boiler, you can go home. If you haven't shoveled enough coal, or if you haven't produced enough steel, then keep on working. And so it was used with a mindset of manual laborers are dumb, manual laborers are stupid, manual laborers need to be told what to do and can't be trusted. So that's the general school of thought from Taylorism at the time, with time studies rather than time and motion, which came later. And so that's their origins. And just one thought, which is, to quote Eisenhower, planning is indispensable, but plans are useless. So the act of planning is a very good thing. And with agile ways of working, you're actually doing more planning than you are with a waterfall way of working, with a traditional sequential big batch way of working, because you're planning continuously. You're doing everything continuously. So you can do anything badly. So you can use a Gantt chart well. So, I'm not completely opposed to a Gantt chart, because a Gantt chart with lines representing activity can be used in the right context, and it can be used to visualize the future. It can be used well and it can be used badly. So what I recommend is, first and foremost, fixate on the outcome roadmap, not on the output roadmap. So, and what I find works well is, imagine like a double layer roadmap. So the top layer of the roadmap is your 3-year OKR, your 1-year OKR, and then your quarterly OKRs. So where do we want to be by the end of Q1? Where do we want to be by the end of the full year? Where do we want to be in 3 years' time? And that's all expressed as outcomes, not as solutions. Underneath that, when you double click on your quarterly OKR, you will have some monthly epics or experiments or features, and then you'll have some weekly iterations and some daily stories. And it's okay, like below the quarterly OKR, I think it's okay to visualize, what the roadmap might be for the product. But the important thing is, the output roadmap should be pivoting all over the place. It shouldn't be locked down. There should not be change control. The outcome roadmap above isn't going to change very much. Yeah, we want to increase market share. We want to increase profit margin. We want to have happy customers. But underneath that, there should be an enormous amount of agility to run quick experiments. We're going to try this in the product roadmap. We're going to try this. We're going to try this. If it works, amplify. If it doesn't work, dampen, pivot. So that's my thought process on kind of planning.
So if I understood that right, what you're saying is that you've got your 3-year roadmap, 1-year roadmap, and then the quarterly roadmap. And underneath the quarterly roadmap, which has got the outcomes, you could use Gantt charts to show how work is progressing to achieve that outcome.
So, and I wouldn't get too, personally, I don't think it's not about getting too hung up on a Gantt chart, using a Gantt chart or not using a Gantt chart. From a principle perspective, yes, first and foremost, fixate on the outcome roadmap, not the output roadmap. Whether you use a Gantt chart or not, first and foremost, focus on the outcomes. And then when you double click on the outcome, underneath the outcomes, you will have an architecture vision, you will have an architecture roadmap, you will have a product vision, you will have a product roadmap. And we need to have that. We need to visualize the future for this product. But the important point here, whether you use a Gantt chart or whether you use an Excel spreadsheet or Google Sheets, doesn't really matter. The most important principle here is the product roadmap, the output roadmap, should be pivoting all over the place. It should be changing frequently. And it should be changing frequently based on thin slices of value, minimizing time to learning so that we can pivot, so that we can achieve the outcome. So if I give you an example, an outcome might be we want to get to the town which is over the river, and we've got 20 people to get across the river, and we want them to be dry and happy. Dear team, you are free to figure out how to cross the river to get to that town. Not telling the team whether to build a bridge or build a boat or for people to swim. In the past, what we would have done is we would have had a project plan where we would have said build a bridge and told the team exactly what to do with requirements handed down the line. But now, team, you're free to go figure. So then the team run a cheap experiment. One person tries to swim. Yeah, it's too deep. It's cold. We're not going to get 20 people across happy. Someone else quickly builds a quick basic canoe. They canoe across. You know what? The water's flowing too quickly. There's rapids. Didn't make it across. Someone else builds a zip line. Awesome. The zip line works. Everyone's dry. It's quick. So the solution ends up being the zip line. So I hope that kind of analogy helps bring it to life, where the product roadmap should be pivoting all over the place to maximize the outcome.
No, it does. It does. Just one thought came over there, which is around the incentive model that you will have. So will the incentive model then be aligned towards after achieving the outcome? Or will there be, and if the outcome is, say, after 3 years, your market share goes up by X% after 3 years. How do you incentivize the team during this period? What model should it be following?
Yeah, that's a great question. So incentives are so important. And I think you can boil down, ways of working, how we do what we do, improving ways of working. You can boil it down to one word, which is incentive. And the other side of incentive is threat. And it's very important to, as per your question, is to align incentives. If incentives are not aligned, there will be problems. So to answer your question around incentives, this is where OKRs, I find, work really well when they're done well. So the anti-pattern is to have OKRs in a role-based silo. Engineering OKRs, quality OKRs, product OKRs, marketing OKRs, sales OKRs. That's an anti-pattern. The pattern is to have value stream aligned OKRs. So again, this could be mortgages, it could be current account, it could be low carbon energy, it could be medicine in healthcare. So what happens here is when you have OKRs which are aligned to the value stream, aligned to the flow of value in your company, the things that you do are value, it could be streaming at Disney. It helps unite people across the job roles to a common goal. So now it doesn't matter whether I'm marketing, sales, engineering, quality, whatever. We're all united. We're all rowing in the same direction. And we succeed or fail, and there is no failing, it's just learning. We succeed and learn as a team together. And I've seen it lead to some really good human behavior where people get behind each other and they help each other out. And it's a truly multidisciplinary team, not only multidisciplinary in IT, but genuinely business plus technology plus ops, multidisciplinary teams. So OKRs are a great way to align incentives.
Right. And I think it's related to the anti-pattern local optimization, where you see only IT getting optimized or only one team of the value chain getting optimized. Can you tell our listeners a bit more about local optimization and also maybe give the example of the team that reduced the time between pulling work from the backlog to the end of development, but still the benefits were not visible to users? What went wrong over there?
Yeah, so to quote Ellie Goldratt, author of The Goal, a system of local optimums is not an optimum system. And local optimization means improving in one role-based silo only. And for example, that could just be improving in software engineering, improving in IT. And if it's no longer the weakest link in the end-to-end chain, there's no point in continuing to strengthen it. If it's no longer the weakest link has now moved. The theory of constraints, put all of your resources behind the biggest constraint, the biggest bottleneck in the end-to-end flow. The bottleneck moves somewhere else. The weakest link moves somewhere else. Identify it, repeat, and repeat for infinity. So the example here is where, you've got the end-to-end flow of value. Your biggest impediments are typically upstream, typically annual budgeting, the portfolio management process, the funding process, and the biggest impediment is not software engineering. And yet, still it's like teams could spend lots of time and effort in reducing the lead time, and you could reduce it by 50%. However, it only has a 5% impact on the actual end-to-end lead time of value because the biggest impediment is upstream.
Yeah, agreed. And what would be the way to solve for it? What's the corresponding pattern?
Number one, visualize the system of work end to end. So a great way to do this is value stream mapping. Get all of the experts in the physical room or the virtual room together at the same time. So you've got experts who know each little bit of their end-to-end process and actually map it out for the first time ever, usually. Visualize it physically or virtually so we can actually see the end-to-end flow. And then ask people for roughly how much time is work waiting in between these stages and roughly how much time are you spending adding value to the work. And then, it's quite easy to then come up with an approximate measure for flow efficiency. Flow efficiency, again, being the amount of time that work is being worked on versus the end-to-end lead time. For most organizations, flow efficiency is 10% or less, which means that work is sitting in a queue waiting for 90% of the time, which is shocking. That's incredibly low. And most organizations are unaware of it because they're not measuring it. So number one, visualize and measure. Make it visible, measure the system of work, and then identify your biggest impediment to the flow of value. It's usually quite obvious. And then work out you've got an impediment, work out how you can alleviate that impediment, run some experiments, start with the champions, and then repeat for infinity.
10% is a shocking number. So what you're saying basically is instead of local optimization, you should be optimizing for the bottlenecks to reduce the flow
end to end.
Bottlenecks. Yep.
Correct. Take a look at the flow end to end. Yep, from concept to cash.
Right. Moving on, let's touch on build the thing right, which is about continuous compliance. What would be a multidisciplinary control team?
So we call them a safety team, and this is a pattern that works well, which is in your safety team, you've got a multidisciplinary, effectively a specialized secondary team. So you might have 10 product teams aligned to a value stream. Let's assume it's mortgages in a retail bank. And then you've got your safety team. And in your safety team, you've got information security, data privacy, fraud, anti-money laundering, compliance, maybe enterprise architecture, anyone who has some mandatory risk stories that need to be implemented. And those could be external regulation, or it could be internal standards, policies and standards. And the pattern that works here is it's a long-lived team, so it's always the same people. The anti-pattern is, you go to InfoSec, you speak to InfoSec, you speak to data privacy. It's always somebody different. You never speak to the same person. They don't understand the customer's context. They're not specialists in mortgages. So that's an anti-pattern. And that's the world that I've experienced in the past. So with these long-lived safety teams, you can have some amazing innovation coming from the safety team who actually deeply understand the customer and the customer's unarticulated needs. And it's not one size fits all because the safety team, once a quarter, there's a formal kind of conversation with the product teams. This is what we're planning to build in the next quarter based on our OKR. And then the safety team will decide on the kind of the risk appetite, on the risk profile. And then it might be a case of we're going to talk every day, we're going to join your stand-up, or it might be a case of it's not risky at all, so we don't need to speak for another quarter. And it's also not one size fits all when it comes to the risk stories that are going to be implemented by the teams. So if you're building something that's risky, you're going to have a whole load of risk stories, encrypting data, and so on, two-factor authentication. If what you're building is not risky and it's internal, then don't worry, you don't need to do all these things. The anti-pattern, which is how it used to be for most companies, is one size fits all. Everyone has to comply to the same 200 set of controls.
Do you have any specific examples where things have gone wrong by not focusing on safety?
So I don't, because what I have experience of implementing is we built in the safety checks So we could see both left to right and right to left. So left to right is the path to production. Programmatically, we could see if someone had not implemented a mandatory risk story, and that was reported in a report. And right to left is going backwards along the software development lifecycle. We could see if somebody had pushed a new binary into production, and if we couldn't trace it back to the risk stories, that also shone a big red light in a report, which was then followed up at a senior level. So actually what I've seen is we managed to get to a point where there was both speed and control, not just speed out of control or control with no speed. Just one other thing to mention, Brijesh, is that where I have seen it historically be a problem in the old way of working is, we had a agile lighthouse initiative, and it was meant to be a big fanfare and the spotlight and, hey, look, great case study of agile ways of working. And it was like the day before go live, super agile, and information security came up with 6 months of unplanned work. And that was the old way of working. And, it's like, we're going to inspect it at the end and, here's a bunch of new requirements. So that was funny because this was meant to be a showcase for agile ways of working. And you know what? We learned it absolutely was not agile at the end, and we learned from it.
Right. And this was primarily because the safety team was not closely aligned.
There wasn't a safety team.
Okay.
Yeah. In that particular example, this was before we even created the concept of a safety team. So that was an example of the old ways of working where, we'll inspect it at the end and, by the way, here's a bunch of new requirements. And it was probably because it was someone different every time you speak to InfoSec or data privacy.
Right. I want to touch on the measure happier. How do you measure team morale and satisfaction? Any suggestions on that?
Yeah, so a couple of ways. The first way is usually there is an existing HR colleague engagement survey which is running. And so they usually have a colleague engagement score. So it's usually pretty easy because it already exists. And start with that. The other thing that I recommend doing, that we normally do, is we also have our own colleague ways of working survey, and typically we'll alternate the external third-party colleague survey, usually being run from HR, with the ways of working colleague survey. And the ways of working colleague survey is the questions are very specifically worded to do with ways of working. And what I found to work well is we ask the same questions every single time. It goes out every 6 months. So it kind of alternates with the HR one, which is every 6 months. So effectively, every quarter, we have a feedback loop. It works really well to ask the same questions. And one of the questions is a net promoter score type question. So in terms of how we measure colleague engagement, not only is there the proprietary third-party engagement calculation, there is also our own net promoter score type question. And every single time we see the Kubler-Ross curve, we see the peak of excitement, we see the trough of disillusionment, this is hard, and then we see people climbing out of the hole. So it's always up, down, up is what we see on the net promoter score. And what also works really well is to have free text fields in that survey. And what we do is we use the colleague feedback to then drive the strategy for the next quarter. So every time I've done this, we've put a lot of effort into listening to what colleagues are saying, which then influences the approach.
Right. Thanks, John. In the last section, I'd like to close off the show talking about what's in the future. We have seen software development methodologies evolve from waterfall to an iterative model, using agile lean principles and other tools. As software changes with the introduction of AI, machine learning, and no code, how do you see software development methodologies evolving? So what would be the new ways of working?
I think it's even more kind of biz DevOps, if you like. I think there's still what I observe is there's still a big gap between, in quotes, the business and technology. There's a lot of room for improvement in terms of properly multidisciplinary teams, which are business and IT together. We can still have reporting lines into technology. We can still have reporting lines into non-technology. The difference is that the work is not flowing through the reporting line. The difference is the reporting line is there for personal development and career growth and care for the individual, and work is flowing in the value stream. So I think, to answer your question, Brijesh, I think it is increasingly kind of biz DevOps, which for me is a bit back to the future. For me, it's kind of, in my personal experience, it's how we used to work in the early 1990s. Yeah, I think that's it. It's like, this breaking down the barriers, even for some Silicon Valley companies, even with the notion of product and engineering, there still ends up being a business silo, a product silo, and then an engineering silo. And product are just doing what business analysts used to do in the past, which is talking to the business, writing requirements, and handing them to engineering, which is not great. So I think more outcome focused, more value stream alignment, biz DevOps.
Excellent. We covered a lot of ground here, but if there was one thing you would want our listeners to remember from this show, what would it be? And I already have a very good inkling about what you're going to say, but I want to hear it from you.
Focus on the outcomes.
Yep.
That's it. First and foremost, it's not about agile. It's not about lean. It's not about DevOps. Those are tools in the toolbox. First and foremost, number one, understand what outcomes you're going after. For example, better value, sooner, safer, happier. Feel free to use those words and then measure them and then continuously have fun, continuously improve in line with those outcomes.
Great. Was there anything we missed that you would like to mention?
Only maybe just to reinforce the importance of incentive and the importance of leadership. Leadership behavior will make it or break it. It is grassroots will hit a glass ceiling. There will be limited success trying to do this bottom up only. It has to be, in my opinion, this has to be top down and bottom up and sideways and middle out. So maybe just to mention that there has to be an incentive for this to be successful across an organization, improving ways of working, improving how you do what you do. There has to be an incentive from the top table to improve. Because if there isn't an incentive from the top table to improve, people won't improve.
Right. People can follow you on Twitter, but how else can people get in touch?
LinkedIn, Twitter, LinkedIn, and also our website, soonersaferhappier.com.
Jon, thank you for coming on the show. It's been a real pleasure. This is Brijesh Ammanath for Software Engineering Radio. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening to SE Radio, an educational program brought to you by IEEE Software Magazine. For more about the podcast, including other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. To provide feedback, you can comment on each episode on the website or reach us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or through our Slack channel at seradio.slack.com. You can also email us at team@se-radio.net. This and all other episodes of SE Radio is licensed under Creative Commons License 2.5. Thanks for listening.